All right, one person is here, which is enough for me. I figured I've been reading this book um, on and off for a little while now, and it seems pretty pertinent for current events. I think that the left has a long history of violence, um, especially extremists, and I honestly think we need to shut down extremism on either side of the aisle. But this is a book about leftist violence. I think the radical left has a huge violence problem, as seen in many of the reactions to what happened to Charlie Kirk. Um, Although I don't agree with the witch hunts that take place on Twitter, it seems now that a lot of people are trying to get other people fired for their reactions. I think all sides need to take a step back and as the governor of Utah said today during the press conference regarding Charlie Kirk's shooter, touch some grass. So, I think I'm just going to read maybe chapter one here. It looks like the second I start talking about the left and its violence problem, I left the one viewer left, but that's okay. This will be up here in case anyone wants to listen to it. So let's go ahead and share the book because I have it as an ebook. So this is Days of Rage. This is about the Weather Underground. We're gonna skip the introduction, the prologue, all of that stuff. We're just going to get right into it. And if you want me to send you the link to this privately, you can email me and I will send it to you and you can read this on your own. So this is from Days of Rage, Chapter 1. The revolution ain't tomorrow, it's now, you dig? Sam Melville and the Birth of the American Underground. New York City, August 1969. On a drizzly Friday afternoon, they drove north out of the city in a battered station wagon, 6 more shaggy radicals, a baby, and 2 dogs, heading toward a moment unlike any they had seen. Jimmy, Janice, the Who, the Dead, they were like hundreds of thousands of young Americans that season, 1 part aimless, druggy, and hedonistic, 2 parts angry, idealistic, and determined to right all the wrongs they saw in 1969 America: racism, repression, police brutality, the war. Traffic on the New York State Thruway was slow, but a pipe full of hashish and a few beers left everyone feeling fine. 10 miles from their destination, the car sagged into a traffic jam. That's the problem with this. Anyway, one couple got out to walk. The girl who was 22 that day was Jane Alpert, a petite, bookish honors graduate of Swarthmore College with brunette bangs. She wrote for Rat Subterranean News, the kind of East Village radical newspaper that published recipes for Molotov cocktails. Later, friends would describe her as sweet and gentle. As she stepped from the car, Alpert lifted a heavy copy of Rat to ward off the raindrops. Beside her trudged her 35-year-old lover, Sam Melville, a rangy, broad-chested activist who wore his thinning hair dangling around his shoulders. Melville was a troubled soul, a brooder with a dash of charisma, a man determined to make his mark. Only Jane and a handful of their friends knew how he intended to do it. Only they knew about the dynamite in the refrigerator. Slogging through the rain, they didn't touch the Woodstock Festival until almost midnight, or they didn't reach it until almost midnight. Ducking into a large tent, Jane curled up beside a stranger's air mattress and managed an hour of sleep. She found Melville the next morning, wandering through the movement booths mannered by yippies and crazies and Black Panthers and many more. After a day listening to music, she glimpsed him deep in conversation with one of the crazies, a 30-something character named George Demerol, who could usually be found at New York demonstrations in a crash helmet and a purple cape. That George, Melville said as they left. He really is crazy. I offered to spell him at the booth, but he said only bona fide crazies ought to work the official booth. That's because he's old, Jane said. He wants to be a 25-year-old, or he wants to be a 20-year-old freak. When when Melville dropped his head, Jane realized she had offended him. He and Demerol were almost the same age. The echoes of Jimi Hendrix's last solo could still be heard at Woodstock on Monday morning when Jane left the East Village apartment she shared with Melville and walked to work. They had been squabbling all summer and had decided to see other people. That night, though, she canceled a date and returned to the apartment to find him glumly sitting on the bed. "I thought you had a date," he said. "I changed my mind." "Why?" "Because I'd rather be with you." He said nothing, which was unusual. She lay beside him. "What's wrong, Sam?" she asked. It took a moment before he said, "I planted a bomb this afternoon." The first bombs had already exploded in America, scores of them, and self-styled revolutionaries were already as thick as their air that sweltering August night. But the man who really started it all, who became a kind of patient zero for the underground groups of the 1970s, was Sam Melville. Until he and his friends began planting bombs around Manhattan in the summer of 1969, protest bombings had been mostly limited to college campuses, typically Molotov cocktails heaved towards ROTC buildings late at night, all but forgotten today. Melville was the first to take anti-government violence to a new level, building large bombs and using them to attack symbols of American power. While later groups would augment his tactics with bank robbery, kidnapping, and murder, Melville's remained the essential blueprint for almost every radical organization of the next decade. He was born Samuel Grossman in the Bronx in 1934, making him a decade older than many of his revolutionary peers. In his teens, he adopted the surname Melville after the author of his favorite book, Moby Dick. He had quite a difficult upbringing. His parents separated before he was 5, and he grew up poor in Buffalo. He drifted through his 20s, working as a draftsman. By the time he turned 31, he had married and separated and was teaching plumbing at a trade school, aimless and unsatisfied, searching for a purpose into his life. He found it during the Columbia University unrest in 1968, when angry students were occupying campus buildings in protest of discriminatory policies, and the Vietnam War. Their cause enthralled Melville, who quit his job on an impulse and took one delivering copies of a radical newspaper, The Guardian. He began dating Jane after selling her a subscription. Jane had grown up in Forest Hills, Queens, and knew next to nothing about Melville's two specialities, radical politics and sex, both of which she found she liked quite a bit. Under his guidance, she became intoxicated by life in the movement. The demonstrations, the sit-ins, the meetings, the sense that the world was changing and she was helping make it happen. "This country's about to go through a revolution," Melville told her. "I expect it to happen before the decade is over, and I intended to be a part of it." Jane threw herself into the brave new world of radical politics with a convert's zeal, taking the job at Rat Subterranean News. She and Melville moved in together, renting an apartment on East 11th Street. It was there, amid a hazy tableau of marijuana and movement politics, that she realized Melville's talk of revolution wasn't abstract. He wasn't satisfied with placards and slogans. He wanted to do something, something to bring on the revolution. It was in the fall of 1968 that Melville began to talk about bombs. New York City, he knew, had a long history of bombings. There was the anarchist bombing on Wall Street in 1920, which killed 38 people, and another that killed 2 policemen at the World's Fair in 1940. But the bomber who obsessed Melville was the one he knew from boyhood, George Metesky, the original Mad Bomber. A disgruntled employee of Consolidated Edison, Metesky planted 33 bombs around Manhattan between 1940 and his arrest in 1957. 22 of them exploded at Grand Central Terminal at Pennsylvania Station, at Radio City Music Hall, and a dozen or more people were injured. After Columbia, Melville began spray painting buildings with the graffiti, George Metesky was here. For the moment, bombing was still just an idea, but that winter as 1968 gave way to 1969, Melville began planning some kind of bombing campaign with his friends. They were all angry. Times were changing, and not for the better. The movement, the great swelling of young Americans that had thronged the streets in protest over the past 3 years, was crumbling. Everybody sensed it. A new president, Richard Nixon, was entering the White House, pledging to crack down on student radicals. What that meant had become clear at the Democratic National Convention in August, when Chicago police used truncheons to beat down demonstrators, leaving them bloody, bowed, and defeated. Repression. It was all anyone in the movement was talking about that winter. Many were giving up hope, but others, Melville included, began talking about fighting back, about a genuine revolution, about guns, about bombs, about guerrilla warfare. Jane privately thought it all ridiculous, brave speechifying fueled by too much free time and too many drugs. Does any of this sound familiar? And in time, Melville appeared to drop the subject. It was clear, however, that he wanted to do something, and to Jane's amazement, something arrived unannounced that February. In fact, there were 2 of them, Jean and Jacques. Melville took Jane aside and told her they were genuine revolutionaries, Canadian revolutionaries, dedicated to the freedom of their native Quebec. Their real names were Alain Allard and Jean-Pierre Charette, and their terrorist group, Front de Libération du Québec, was known as the FLQ and responsible for more than 160 acts of violence in Canada, killing at least 8 people since 1963, including the bombing of the Montreal Stock Exchange just days before. They were on the run. Melville had not only met the 2 Canadian terrorists through mutual acquaintances, but had agreed to hide them in a friend's apartment. They wanted to get to Cuba. Melville had promised to take care of everything, and for the next few weeks he did. He arranged for a post office box, retrieved their mail, brought them newspapers, even bought their food. In turn, he spent hours closeted with the 2, quizzing them on the minutiae of revolutionary work, the ins and outs of safe houses, false papers, and most of all, bombs. Jean and Jacques drew Melville diagrams and showed him how to insert bombs into briefcases. They even tutored him on how to cover his mouth when telephoning in bomb threats. One night, Jane returned to the apartment and found Melville pacing nervously. "They've come up with a plan," he said. Jane stared. "They want to hijack a plane to Cuba. You're not serious." They were. He was. Even though every nerve in her body told Jane not to, she agreed to help. She did it, she told herself, out of love. The real reason, though, she couldn't admit it for years, was the excitement. She was involved in something bigger than herself. They were changing the world. This was justified. This was important. Over the next 2 weeks, everything came together quickly. Melville managed to buy a gun. Jane selected a Miami-bound plane to hijack. On Monday, May 5th, they followed the 2 Canadians to LaGuardia Airport and said goodbye. "How can we ever thank you?" one asked. "We are all fighting for the same cause," Jane replied. That night, Jane and Melville hunched over a radio until the announcer on WBAI read the news bulletin. National Airlines Flight number 91 has been diverted from Miami to Cuba, where it has now landed." Melville and Jane shouted for joy, hopping like rabbits. They were so excited. "Those little bastards," Melville crowed over and over again. "They did it. They did it." After the hijacking, Melville's confidence soared. Finally, after months of talk, he began laying concrete plans for the bombing he envisioned. He started practicing with disguises. Jane was startled one day when, laying in the bathtub, she saw a strange man enter the apartment. He looked like a businessman, clean-shaven, wearing a suit and a fedora. It took a moment before she realized it was Melville. "We can't afford to look like hippies anymore," he explained. "The revolution ain't tomorrow, it's now. Ya dig?" Jane saw her lover's bombing plans as just another of his fantasies. Talk of bombing she dismissed as a silly scheme intended to win my attention and boost his self-esteem. Yet Jane's skepticism only seemed to propel Melville forward. One night that June, she found him hunched over a hand-drawn map. That day, he announced, he and a friend had staked out a building site and followed a truck carrying dynamite all the way to the Major Deegan Expressway. Following the truck, he said, would lead to the source of its dynamite. Jane looked at him balefully. Maybe, she suggested, he should try looking in the yellow pages under explosives. When he did, Melville was startled to find 3 listings, including one in the Bronx. All were for a company called Explo Industries. Soon he began talking excitedly about plans to rob the Explo warehouse. Jane rolled her eyes. She might have laughed out loud had she known what Melville also didn't. A short drive north, in much of New England, dynamite could be purchased simply by walking into any construction supplies retailer. After staking out the warehouse, Melville and 2 pals made their move on the night of Monday, July 7th, 1969. They left at 11. Jane waited. Midnight came and went. Another hour ticked by. She watched the clock. At 1:20 a.m., Sam and his pals burst into the apartment, wide smiles on their faces. They plunked down 4 boxes on the kitchen floor. The robbery had gone smoothly. Once the night watchman saw their gun, he offered no resistance. They left him tied up. Jane gingerly opened the top of one of the boxes. Inside was row upon row of dynamite sticks, each wrapped in paper. The words nitroglycerin, highly flammable, were printed on each. They took the yogurt and the salad out of the refrigerator and slid the boxes in. Sam was as happy as Jane had ever seen him. Once everyone left, they made love, Alpert wrote later, the most tender and passionate in a long time. The dynamite in the couple's refrigerator quickly became the focus of discussion among their dozen or so radical friends, all of whom, like Melville, were eager to put it to use. A few days after the robbery, Melville rented a $60 a month apartment on East 2nd Street, where they moved the dynamite. The new flat became his clandestine workshop, where he began experimenting with bomb designs. On Saturday, July 26th, the 16th anniversary of Fidel Castro's disastrous raid on a Cuban army barracks, he told Jane he was ready to mark the date with their first action. Their target would be a United Fruit warehouse on a Hudson River pier in Lower Manhattan. United Fruit, best known for its bananas, Chiquita bananas, had been a major investor in Cuba. Melville had already built 2 bombs and slid them into large vinyl pocketbooks. At dusk, he and Alpert and a friend strolled down to the Hudson, where the warehouse with the words United Fruit emblazoned on one side lay in darkness. Standing at the end of the dock, they could see no security, no watchman. The only sound other than the whiz of cars on the nearby West Side Highway was the lapping of water below. While the women stood guard, Melville took one of the bombs and disappeared into the gloom. He returned a minute later, took the second bomb, then left again. He hurried back and herded the women away, saying, "Let's go." They rushed back to their apartment and turned on the radio, eagerly awaiting the news. None came. In the morning, Jane pored over the Times. Nothing. They began to suspect that police had covered up the news. That afternoon, they made an anonymous call to WBIA, the radical radio station, and an hour later it finally carried the news. The two bombs set beside the warehouse had blown a hole in an outer wall and wrecked a door. Unfortunately, they learned, United Fruit no longer used the facility. It was being used instead by a tugboat company. Melville was crestfallen. "I used up 40 sticks of dynamite on that job," he complained. "That's 1/4 of what we've got." Their friends were furious at being left out of the plan, but that wasn't what delayed their new bombing campaign. Albert came home from work one evening and found Melville in bed with another one of her friends. Afterwards, he, he wanted to break up. Then he changed his mind. They began to fight. Then they agreed to try sleeping with other people. Melville was morose. And then came that rainy weekend. They all went up to Woodstock and then sullenly drove back to New York. And Albert came home from a long day at work, and Melville confessed that he had planted a new bomb without her. "Where did you plant the bomb?" Albert asked. "At Marine Midland Bank." The name meant nothing to Albert. It wasn't a target they had discussed. It stood at 140 Broadway, a few blocks up from Wall Street. "Why Marine Midland?" Albert asked. "No particular reason," Melville said. "I just walked around Wall Street till I found a likely-looking place. It's one of those big new skyscrapers, millions of tons of glass and steel, some fucking phony sculpture in the front. You just look at the building and people going in and out of it, and you know." "What time did you set it up for?" 11 o'clock. Albert stared at the clock, barely an hour away. "Sam, you never even cased that building," she said, worried. "Do you know what the Wall Street area is like at 11 o'clock on a weeknight? People work there until after midnight, cleaning women, file clerks, key punch operators. Did you make a warning call or anything?" Melville shifted. Albert all but dragged him to a payphone up the street. She made the call, reaching a security guard. She told him about the bomb and pleaded with him to evacuate the building. The guard seemed annoyed. "I'd like to help you, lady, really I would," he said. "But I don't leave this post until midnight when I make the rounds." "But the bomb's going to go off at 11. "I see your point," the guard sighed. "I'll do what I can." Back in the apartment, Albert and Melville sat by the radio waiting. The news came a few minutes after 11. Melville simply wandered into the building and left the bomb next to an elevator on the 8th floor. That night, around 50 people, almost all women, were working on the floor, inputting data into bookkeeping machines. When the bomb went off at 10:45, the explosion destroyed several walls, blowing an 8-foot hole in the floor and dumping a ton of debris down into the 7th floor, where more people were working. Windows shattered, generating a blizzard of flying glass. Several women's dresses were cut to shreds. Sirens echoed through lower Manhattan. Ambulances carted away 20 people who had been injured, none of them seriously. Albert was apoplectic, not because of the injuries, but because of Melville's motivation. The bombing, she saw, had nothing to do with the war or Nixon or racism. She knew Melville better than anyone, and she knew this was about her. I'm going to pause here. First of all, I think a lot of this sounds familiar. Youthful people with not much purpose in their life, getting bored, becoming radicalized. Also, Melville sounds like an idiot. He sounds like a narcissistic idiot. I mean, so does she. So those are my notes so far on this random impromptu reading of Days of Rage, Chapter 1. I think most criminals are actually really very stupid, especially obviously the ones that get caught. And I think it's interesting to note here that this man seems, consumed with himself, a hero in his own mind, a total narcissist. a total psychopath, right? Doesn't care about anybody who's in the building. And so, perhaps it is a mistake to assign a left or a right to these kinds of people that opt for violence. Maybe it's, beyond that. You guys can tell me what you think. I do think that um, radicalism leads to this kind of stuff on both sides. It just seems to take different forms. But the profile of the criminal always seems to be kind of similar. It has an inferiority complex at the same time, delusions of grandeur. Um, anyway, just if you're here, let me know what you think. I haven't checked back in on the chat, but I will in a little bit here. I mean, they sound like they're made for each other, really. As she wrote years later, because I had threatened to abandon him for even one night by sleeping with another man, he had taken revenge on a skyscraper full of people. Afterward, they drafted a communique which called the bombing an act of political sabotage. Jane typed up 3 copies and sent them to Rat, The Guardian, and the Liberation News Service. Albert was actually at Rat when the paper's editor, Jeff Shiro, slid open the envelope and read it. "Far fucking out," he yelped. For their next bombing, a group of their friends pitched in. On September 18, 1969, as President Nixon delivered a speech at the United Nations 2 miles north, Albert and the others gathered around Melville as he assembled a bomb. He used 15 sticks of dynamite, a blasting cap, and a West clock's alarm clock. When he finished, he lowered the device into a handbag Jane had stolen. Wearing a white A-line dress and kid gloves, she slid the bag strap over her shoulder, gave the group a salute, and left. She took the bus downtown, cushioning the bag on her lap, and got off at Foley Square, home to the U.S. Courthouse with its vast colonnaded facade, the New York County Courthouse, and Albert's destination, the 2-year-old Federal Building, a 42-story rectangle of glass and steel. At the elevator bank, Albert pressed the button for the 40th floor. Reaching it, she stepped into an empty hallway. She left the bomb in an electrical equipment closet. Around 1 a.m., the conspirators gathered on the roof of an apartment house in the East Village. They had trained a telescope on the upper floors of the Federal Building. All the skyscraper's lights remained ablaze. High atop the building, an airplane beacon blinked its orange eye. They waited, taking turns at the telescope. The minutes ticked by like hours. Then suddenly, a few minutes before 2, every light in the Federal Building silently winked out. "Holy shit," someone breathed. "An explosion of undetermined origin," the Times called the next morning, by which time Melville had already learned that they had bombed not the Army Department as planned, but an office suite belonging to the Department of Commerce. The blast had blown a 6-foot hole in a wall and a 25 by 40-foot hole in the ceiling, mangling furniture and file cabinets on the floor above. No one had been injured. A few days later, Albert was walking into the Rat offices when she saw police cruisers outside. She stopped at a payphone and called in. An editor said the cops wanted the Marine Midland communique. Albert killed time in a diner before returning. The cops were gone. But she knew that she and her friends had been sloppy. Too many people were too chatty. Still, she allowed herself to relax when Melville left for a radical gathering in North Dakota. Melville was still away when some of the others, led by a young militant named Jim Duncan, decided they wanted to bomb something too. Duncan targeted the Selective Service Induction Center on Whitehall Street in Lower Manhattan, the building where every man of age in the borough had to register for the draft. On the night of October 7th, Duncan left his bomb in a 5th-floor bathroom. When it detonated at 11:20 p.m., the explosion wrecked the entire floor, scattering debris throughout the building and blowing out windows. No one was injured. The communique, which Duncan wrote himself, was mailed to media outlets across the country. It said the bombing was in support of the North Vietnamese, legalized marijuana, love, Cuba, legalized abortion, and all the American revolutionaries and GIs who are winning the war against the Pentagon and Nixon. Surrender now. The reaction at RAT and among everyone they knew in the movement was joyful. And this kind of reminds me of, the aftermath of the shooting of Charlie Kirk, of the assassination. They can't contain themselves. They're so full of joy. And this kind of brings me to my point about, Luigi Mangione and the kind of folk hero aspect of this thing that I'm calling mimetic murder. But basically, this domestic terrorism, where if you target, as long as you're targeting the right person, then those acts of violence are justified. And that is rhetoric that comes directly from radical leftists. And I'm reading this to show you that it's been decades of this kind of stuff. Afterward, Jane and the others planned their most ambitious attack to date, a triple bombing, aimed squarely at centers of American corporate power. They planned to strike on Monday, November 10th, 1969. The day before, Melville returned, having run out of money. Once he got some, he said he was going back to North Dakota. He spent the day talking with his pal, George Demerel of the Crazies, excitedly telling him everything. The two agreed to bomb something together that week. Jane was beside herself. None of them cared much for Demerel. Still, they decided to go ahead. Jane typed up the communique in advance, mailing it to the newspapers. On Monday, they built bombs. That night, they left them at their targets, the RCA building at Rockefeller Center and General Motors building at Fifth Avenue and 59th Street, and the headquarters of Chase Manhattan Bank. Everything went smoothly. By midnight, everyone had returned to the apartment. Then they phoned in their warnings and waited. The bombs began detonating at 1 a.m. The first exploded on the empty 16th floor of the Chase Manhattan building, just as police, reacting to the warning call, finished a fruitless search. The blast ripped through an elevator shaft, sending debris cascading all the way down the street. The bomb on the 20th floor of the RCA building detonated in a vacant office suite, panicking dozens of guests in the Rainbow Room restaurant, 45 floors above. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns scurried down a freight elevator and stairwells to the street. The office suite was demolished. Dozens of windows were blown out. The bomb at the General Motors building accomplished much the same. Once again, the sound of sirens echoed through the streets of Manhattan. Alpert and the others were thrilled. For police, however, the bombings represented an escalation they could not ignore. This was simply unprecedented. 3 bombings in one night? The city had never seen anything like it. The next morning, the NYPD's cigar-chomping chief of detectives, Albert Seidman, tramped through the wreckage, shaking his head and muttering under his breath. His men had been investigating the bombings since the first one at United Fruit and had made no headway whatsoever. He decided to form a special squad of 25 hand-picked detectives to find the perpetrators. Seidman considered calling the FBI, who he suspected knew more than he did after the federal building bombing. The head of the Bureau's New York office, a square-jawed veteran named John Malone, had called to say they were working an informant in the case. That morning, as Seidman was establishing his command center at the RCA building, Malone called again. It took a while, Malone said, but the informant finally gave up our man. Who is it? Seidman asked. His name is Sam Melville. Let me see if anyone's here. It looks like it's just me and Terry and Riddick. Riddick, I don't want to mess up your name, but hello. What's going on, Terry? You'd be snitching so quick. These people are disgraceful. I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, it seems like they're kind of meant for each other, doesn't it? All right, let's continue and finish this chapter, hopefully. Thank you both for joining me. The three explosions ignited a new kind of civic tumult that would become all but commonplace in New York and other cities in the next decade. A rash of bombings followed by a wave of copycat threats, followed by the mass evacuations of skyscraper after skyscraper, leaving thousands of office workers milling about on sidewalks, wondering what had happened. That Tuesday, the NYPD was obliged to check out 300 separate bomb threats. The next day, November 12th, the Associated Press counted 30 just between the hours of 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. A dozen buildings had to be emptied, including the Pan Am Building on 45th Street, the Columbia Broadcasting Building on 51st Street, and a library in Queens. Afterwards, the Times editorialized that periodic evacuation of buildings may become a new lifestyle for the New York office worker. And that's kind of a dim, prescient kind of thing here where, I work in schools and we have to do these active shooter drills, I think once a month, if not every other month. And, when you're doing these drills, you're thinking to yourself, where are we? What are we doing? Why is it like this? So let's continue. The columnist Sidney Zion, noting how powerless the city appeared during a string of bombings now entering its fourth month, said New York was rapidly becoming Scare City. Even as Melville and his friends rejoiced that Tuesday, teams of undercover FBI and NYPD men began filtering into the neighborhood. The next day, Albert Seidman heard from the FBI's John Malone. Our informant says Melville is already doing another job tonight, Malone said. This time they plan to place bombs in the U.S. Army trucks parked outside a National Guard armory. The trucks will be driven inside at night, and the bombs will go off a few hours later. Which armory? He didn't say. Hold on a second. I just lost my window. He didn't say. There were three, two in Manhattan, one in Queens. We can cover them all, Malone said. In fact, we can ask the Army to park plenty of trucks outside each armory. He can have his pick. All that day, Malone and Seidman took reports from the surveillance teams. By mid-afternoon, they believed that Melville was working in his shop on East 2nd Street. Not until it was too late would anyone realize he wasn't. So let's actually take a short break here and look up these people, right? Terry says, yeah, I love when two worthless people take one another off the dating market. Oh my. Yeah, they really do seem like they're meant for each other. So let's see, Sam, Melville. What a looker this guy is. Hold on, let me get the image up here. So actually this shows all of them. Let me just switch my screen out so that you guys can see what these people looked like. Please bear with me because I only have one computer screen here. So this is Sam Melville. So this picture's, here we go. So here's Sam Melville. This is George Demerol, who they were talking about, right? This is Lauren Alpert, the lover of Sam Melville. And this is John Huey here. So these are the people that we are talking about in the beginning of this book, Days of Rage. But this book will also talk about Bill Ayers, who was closely linked to Obama, and Bernadine Dorn. And I don't know if it's quite a long book, but I think it's pretty pertinent to discuss, considering what's going on in this country right now, even though I think it's a little bit of a mistake to try to pin any kind of left-right ideology on the people who are carrying out these mass shootings, like the Minneapolis shooter or the man who shot, I mean, he's really a boy, the young man who shot Charlie Kirk, I think what's happened, it's a little bit different where they're, like I've said before, they're in these online spaces. They're very dark, warped spaces. And I think they get really, like, for lack of better terminology, like mind effed, you know what I mean? So I think it's maybe a mistake, and it might be a mistake to pin an ideology on these people too. I mean, it really seems like sheer nihilism drives them to create terror. And I'm not sure really if that's a left or a right thing. I think it's more of a fascist kind of thing, a fascist nihilism. So, let me see what if you guys are saying anything. All right, well, let's continue. It's kind of hard to switch back and forth between the screens, but I'm trying my best. So, Melville had left the apartment that morning at 8, ducking out to meet his friend Robin Palmer, who had planned a bombing of his own. It was to be a busy day, Melville's last before returning to North Dakota the next morning. He was determined to go out with a bang, literally, with two separate actions, one with Palmer that evening, the other with George Demerel later that night. Palmer's target, which he had scouted himself, was the Criminal Courts Building at 100 Center Street, where a group of Black Panthers, the so-called Panther 21, was on trial for alleged conspiracy to kill New York policemen. That morning, Melville built at least 5 dynamite bombs. I want to pause here, though, too, and say that I do think the radical left, to be specific, really does idolize criminals and criminality. They see it as revolutionary. Okay, so that morning, Melville built at least 5 dynamite bombs. Afterwards, they took the subway downtown to the courthouse and slid one behind a plumbing access panel in a 5th-floor men's room. They were careful. No one noticed. The bomb exploded at 8:35 p.m., demolishing the men's room, leveling a 70-foot terracotta wall and shattering windows. Pipes burst, spilling a river of water down through the stairwells. Other than those at a night court trial, 3 floors above, few people were in the building. One woman sitting on a toilet a floor below the explosion was blown 15 feet through the air, but was unhurt. Oh my goodness, what a miracle. Albert Seidman took the call while at dinner in Midtown. Roaring downtown in his limousine, he toured the wreckage, broken glass crunching beneath his shoes, so angry he could spit. Melville had done this under their very noses. However, they had all 3 New York armories under surveillance now, and one last chance to stop him before he struck again. As Seidman simmered, Jane Alpert returned home from work. She found Melville standing in the dark, peering through the window blinds. He put a finger to his lips. "They're back," he murmured. "You're sure?" she asked. "Same white car, same guys." "Sam, if you know it's the bomb squad, then don't go out. Stay here until they leave." He gave her a long, lingering hug. "I can't stay," he said. "I promised George I'd meet him." Then he kissed her once more, picked up his knapsack and slung it over his shoulder and left. Inside the bag were 4 ticking bombs. This time they saw him. An FBI agent atop a neighboring building watched as Melville and George Demerel emerged onto the roof and scrambled across 6 adjacent rooftops before sliding out a doorway onto East 3rd Street. Melville was wearing an olive drab Air Force uniform, Demerel work pants, and a denim jacket. Once on the street, they split up. FBI agents trailed Melville as he trotted down into the subway, taking the number 6 train north. He emerged onto the platform at 23rd Street. Above, 2 FBI agents and an NYPD detective named Sandy Tice were waiting in a battered blue Chevrolet. They watched as Melville popped out of the subway entrance and strolled east on 23rd. The Chevrolet slowly followed, 50 yards back. At the end of the block, Melville turned left onto Lexington Avenue. Tice got out and followed on foot. It was 9:45 p.m., keeping well back. Tice followed Melville almost all the way to 26th Street when he spotted George Demerel lingering on the corner at 25th, presumably serving as a lookout. Tice stepped to one side, studying the menu outside an Armenian restaurant, as Melville disappeared around the corner onto 26th, heading straight towards the armory, where 3 army trucks were lined up along the curb. A minute ticked by. Demerel remained moored in place. Tice meandered back south a block, fearing he would be seen. After another minute or so, Melville reappeared on the corner of 26th and Lexington. To Tice's relief, he still had the knapsack slung over his shoulder. A moment later, Demerel followed Melville back down 26th Street. This time Tice ran forward to follow. When he turned left onto 26th, he was startled to see the 2 barely 20 feet in front of him. Ahead on the south side loomed the enormous red brick armory. The block was nearly empty. Certain he was about to be spotted, Tice looked for cover. Just then, a man in a tight suede suit, walking a tiny Pekingese, strode by. Thinking fast, Tice winked at the man and asked, "Sir, can you tell me where a man might find a little action around here?" Ahead, Tice could see Melville squatting down beside one of the trucks, digging for something in his knapsack. Before the man with the Pekingese could answer, Tice spotted his 2 FBI partners, guns drawn, sprinting towards Melville from the far end of the block. "Drop it," one yelled as Melville hefted the knapsack. Tice broke into a run. "No, no," he shouted. "Don't drop it, for Christ's sake." Melville froze. The 2 FBI agents shoved him and Demerel against one of the trucks as Tice ran up and snatched the canvas bag. He put his ear to it. He heard ticking. "Where's the bomb squad?" Tice shouted. The FBI began searching Melville, who made a face. "Relax," he said. "They're not set to go off until 2 o'clock. News coverage of Melville's arrest spawned another wave of bomb threats across New York the next day, with more than 300 that Friday alone. Dozens of buildings had to be evacuated, including the New York Stock Exchange, Lincoln Center, the General Post Office, the Union Carbide Building, both the New York Times and the Daily News buildings, the Newsweek Building, the Queens Criminal Court, the U.S. Army Military Ocean Terminal in Brooklyn, the Susan Wagner High School on Staten Island, and 3 schools in Great Neck, Long Island. By then, police had already arrested Jane, who joined Melville and George Demerel in jail. All but Melville made bail. Not long after, Demerel was revealed to be the FBI's informant. Interesting. I have read this before, but it was like months ago. I totally forgot. He had been working for the Bureau since 1966. Melville and Jane's friends in the movement, meanwhile, hailed the couple as heroes. And so that's, I think, why the violence is an issue, and that I'm basically saying that the left does have a history of applauding violence and criminals. And I think it's rearing its ugly head now. Anyway, as we can see with the numerous accounts celebrating the death of a man shot in broad daylight, which was totally disgusting. And I don't agree, though, that, I don't agree with witch hunts done by anyone on the internet. I don't think we should go after these people and try to get them fired from their jobs. I think that's very extreme. I don't know what you guys think. Maybe you're for it, not sure. But I just think it's kind of a bad look, and it shows a lack of morality. As Jane was led out to court, a crowd of supporters raised fists and shouted, "Right on," which the Times identified as a new left Black revolutionary phrase of support. The applause continued 2 weeks later during a rally at Times Square Hotel, where 350 supporters listened as Allen Ginsberg read his poetry and the actress Ultraviolet, Andy Warhol's muse, sang. 6 months later, Jane and Melville pled guilty to conspiracy charges. Melville was sentenced to 13 years on federal complaint and 18 on state charges. He was sent to the Attica Correctional Facility outside Buffalo, where he wrote a series of letters that were published as a book, Letters from Attica. After the prison erupted in massive rebellion in September 1971, police characterized Melville as one of the inmate leaders. On September 13th, as state troopers stormed the prison, he was killed in Attica's D Yard. State officials claimed he was shot as he prepared to throw a Molotov cocktail. Later, lawyers for the inmates insisted he had been murdered. Even before his death, Melville had been an inspiration to many young revolutionaries who dreamed of a war against the United States government. He was the first, the trailblazer. In death, he became, perhaps, their greatest martyr. Jane Alpert, meanwhile, didn't go to prison. Instead, like dozens of other young radicals that spring, she went underground. And so here's a preview of the next chapter. If you've enjoyed this, let me know. I will continue reading this book. I think it's a very interesting book. Terry says, I've been radicalized by the internet too, but I never went full crazy. Well, I think it's because you're older and you have a little bit of a better, perhaps like mental hygiene than the people that we're talking about doing these things. And we're talking about very young men. And personally, I think most people don't really even mature until like their 30s. Terry says they think people are criminals because they're victims of oppression, not because they're immoral. I know. I like kind of wrestle with this idea. I also think that like they're just bad people who have no real moral compass. Especially now in this sort of like postmodern atmosphere where like words have been basically diluted down into having no meaning whatsoever. I'm not really sure if that makes sense, but like I don't think a lot of these people have very strong understandings of politics at all, because we're in this postmodern atmosphere where words mean nothing, and or I guess they mean violence. And so like I decry radicalism on both sides, left or right. I think murdering somebody in broad daylight is a disgusting act of violence and terror. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of these people, they just want to inspire terror. I don't think they have any other political motivations. With this, we'll switch back to the image of these people. So let's get these people back up here for a second. So in this case, right, this Sam Melville and Jane Lauren Alpert, and this guy was the informant. That's interesting. In this man's case, I think he was a criminal. He was criminally minded. He was a narcissist and a psychopath and had delusions of grandeur. And I'm not really sure what the appeal would be. I mean, he's not even an attractive man. And so, like I said earlier on in the stream, perhaps it's a mistake to even assign a political ideology to these people other than nihilism and psychopathy, which is not political. They say they're doing these things out of a political motivation. What's disturbing is the reaction from the rest of their comrades, so to speak. So I think that's the larger point here, where even though this guy was criminally insane, he inspired other people to also carry out these radical acts of terror and violence. They want to silence the opposition too, and they do it because they're evil. I'm inclined to agree. I think we're in a spiritual war of good versus evil, and I think it's important to be able to suss out, who these bad actors are, and there are plenty of them on both sides. I think I saw that Andrew Tate was going to make sure that like there were murals of the Ukrainian refugee that was stabbed on the train. I mean, he's evil. So maybe I should make a video about how to spot a Satanist, because they're everywhere. I think even if they don't consider themselves Satanists, just pure evil. Terry says, "Me too. Evil is in the heart, not the flesh." Yeah, I don't. Yeah, and because I've looked at so much of this stuff, and I really wonder. I was looking at I watched the press conference for the shooter of Charlie Kirk, and a lot of it is, it's disturbing too, because when you do like look at pictures of him and his family, and he seemed like a very bright young man, and then you have a lot of these boomer people saying like, oh, it was college that radicalized him, and I don't think that's what it is. I think it's really evil people on the internet. And so I wonder, what happened there? What was he doing? How was his soul corrupted? Because it doesn't look like, so, and you can't tell obviously from pictures or like, but they lived in a very nice house. They seemed to go on a lot of really nice vacations. It seemed like a very nice, stable family. Of course, the looks can be deceiving, so I don't know. But if it's true that he was from a stable family who loved and cared for him, and I think that is true, because the only reason they caught him was that his father figured it out, and his father reported it. So I really think like the internet's like, can be like a very evil, dark place that harms people's psyche. Rip Charlie, indeed. And I think he was, I don't know, like, and then of course you could go like the MK Ultra angle, where like, okay, this kid was programmed to murder online. You could go for the PSYOP angle. I already see like a lot of people who I consider evil, trying to like blame the Jews, right? That's poppycock. I think it's ridiculous. I think we're really looking at, domestic terror issue, and perhaps it would be prudent to shut down Discord. Shut it down. Not that these people wouldn't find other places to coalesce on the internet, but it's made it easier now than ever for them to communicate with each other, to corrupt other people. I believe the kid was probably looking at pornography, which is definitely a mind control corruption of the soul. Anyone that has anger is 2 hoops and a holler from being Jeffrey Dahmer. Yeah. Couldn't stand, well, it's always, see, that's where it goes. It always becomes that. It's the eternal boogeyman, the eternal scapegoat, when the world is a little bit more complicated. And I think it's for like really smooth-brained individuals, if you ask me. I think the world is a complicated place. I think there are a lot of moving parts. And I think what's dangerous, probably what happened to this kid, talking about what he wrote on those shell casings, those are all memes. And I put that in one of my community posts. I read a lot of the kiwi farms today to like do some research on it, because they usually have a lot of really good information as far as like pictures. And I also watched the press conference, and I thought what the governor of Utah said was really pertinent. Yeah, Charlie was not he was not a Jew hater, and I think he represented the faction of conservatives that understands geopolitics a little bit better than some of these other people, who claim to understand geopolitics, but who are just really just evil Satanists. I just think they're evil Satanists. That's my conclusion. I think there's some very evil Jews out there that hate Gentiles and want us dead, but I'm not going to blame Jews for my problems, for every effing murder. I think you could say that of every group of people. I think you could say that of certain radical Black nationalists. Yeah, there's a lot of evil people in the world, and I think evil transcends race. Um, I think I'll circle back and talk about the Charlie Kirk thing maybe like at a different point. Um, but yeah, one wonders what was on the hard drive of this young man, what he was looking at online. And I truly think that that's the core of the issue, these dark places on the internet and being radicalized online and mimicking other shooters. And then of course the memes, it was suggested he was some kind of groiper, which is if I'm sure the listeners of this channel know what those people are, but they're people that basically follow Nick Fuentes, who's a Satanist. he's evil. And I don't think that's the case. I think the most damning thing that he wrote on the shell casings, hold on, let me look at the list again, was this song, the Oh Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, 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 or whatever. That's a song that I guess has been picked up by certain like deranged, I don't even want to call them leftists, but radical leftists, because I guess it was on some kind of, this is how stupid people are, right? It was on some kind of show, and then it was on TikTok, and then they picked it up. It's a song that was sung by, it was like basically an Italian folk song that's anti-fascist. So I think, to me, that indicates that this person wasn't a groiper. It was maybe perhaps a furry of some kind. I don't know. But I think, I'll circle back to that at some other point when I discuss. I mean, he's just given me another section of my thing that I'm writing called Mimetic Murder. He's sort of in between the folk hero and the nihilist. I'm waiting for a little bit more information. Terry says plenty of blacks are racist and want whites dead. I mean, I lived in Philly on and off for like 20 years, and I would always pass the one of my favorite cults of all time, the Black Israelites. They are very special. And they would post up. They'd always be on Market Street. Let me see if I can find an image of them. Yeah, they'd always be posted up on Market Street, yelling at everybody. And that's the other thing you have to keep in mind, is that I think maybe like when you're in a cult, political ideology is not necessarily something you're thinking about. You're thinking about the cult ideology, whatever it might be. And usually cult ideology is a mixture of wild things all together. and again, transcends political belief systems. So these guys were my favorite. I'd always see them yelling at people, usually of about 3 or 4 of them. Just believe people when they show you who they are. Nick Fuentes is a Fed. Yeah, exactly. Terry knows what I mean with that meme. They're the real Jew. They're my favorite cult. They're one of my favorite cults ever because they're so crazy. And I'm very familiar with them and their rantings. And I mean, they've yelled at me before in my lifetime when I lived in Philly. Like, I think America is one of those places that has like so many cults, you probably wouldn't even be able to count them. Um, it's just that kind of place. So I think I'm gonna leave it there. It's been an hour. I read the chapter. If you guys are interested in reading more of that book together, let me know. I hope everybody's well and having a nice time doing whatever they're doing. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, totally agree. Um, but yeah, I hope you have a great Friday if you're listening to this on Friday, and if you're listening to this on catching up, have an awesome time doing whatever you're doing. God bless you and take care.